Okay, well, thank you, both of you. Both very good and very interesting talks. I'm going to start by just summing up what I think I heard and ask a few questions and then open this to the floor. So in Professor Wang's talk, we heard that China's rapidly emerging capitalism is in trouble, both because of Confucian cultural values and because corruption is established and rife within the sort of Chinese economic structure. He argued that this threatens to undermine social stability in China to the extent that social stability is dependent on fairness, opportunity, and exclusivity. Yet, the state itself exacerbates this problem a bit because it's dependent upon the very structure that is promoting the capitalist expansion. And the way I understood it, might be a temporal confound here, in that in the short term, if you actually attack the sort of crony capitalism, that will lead to a crash or depression in economic productivity, even though in the longer term, doing so would probably make a lot more sense. But I did have one of the questions that came to mind in Professor Wang's talk had to do with this whole Confucian cultural norm of accepting one's station in life. And it seems that that would actually lead to the problem being less problematic than if people were less tolerant of that. So I think that that's a tension that I'd like to hear a little bit more about. Going on to Professor Sassen's talk, it seems that the disconnect is the opposite. Instead of there being a disconnect, there's a question really of expectations that people do have and that do demand, and that people who are displaced might actually, that might be a real problem. So what I'm hearing is that she's saying that there's a new form of capitalism that is emerging. That form of capitalism has to do with the aggregation of businesses and the flows of capital to be aggregated into mechanisms of high finance, especially loans in the global south and also more recently in North America with the subprime crisis. And that there's also, alongside of that, or maybe contributing to it, a change in agency. The agents are no longer individuals or even corporations so much, but they are transnational institutions and governments. And so the outlooks and the way that those agents behave might be very different from the way that individual investors and companies may behave. And that might lead to a sort of brutality, as she put it. And that third, the individuals and communities that are subject to these interventions, these changes, are increasingly subordinated to the larger interests themselves. So that raises questions of where this is going, and I think how much longer it can continue and what it evolves into, really. Almost a situation similar to China, where you have a great aggregation of power, a concentration of vast financial power and influence. Whether this is tolerable or whether this is maybe a natural form of evolution in capitalism. And experiences, I think, suggest that both might be possible if you look around the world at different economic structures that you can see. And there are questions, I think, about whether this process is really a zero-sum game. So if there are massive investments or extensions of credit, really, to populations that are less fortunate, even if those do serve certain types of interests that are not necessarily aligned with the individuals that are supposedly being helped, whether that actually in itself transforms the outlook of the people who are supposed to be served. possibly because they are adjusting their expectations and returning to an old style of life, if it's even possible, is just not conducive to stability and to happiness.
Happiness, right, yes.
So let's start with that.
Thank you very much. You want to respond first?
Sure, about the tension.
Okay. Yeah. You just mentioned that if since the Chinese traditional culture like Confucianism tolerate the the unequal rights and privileges and reach and the disparity of the income distribution, you are right. If the cultural law change, of course, it's no problem in China because since they can tolerate that, it's okay. But the question is because I want to save the time for you. Otherwise, I will mention that. In fact, the culture is changed quite a lot. Americans make a lot of contribution. Our Chinese students come to study in the United States and study abroad, and also the current, the internet and modern press and communications, and make Chinese now, they are not tolerate. Now they don't tolerate anymore. Shout every day. Why we, the contribute so much and get so little. So that's the why, that's the problematic. So that's why I say there may be 2 or 3 years, the Chinese, the federalism, Chinese, was a leading country in the world for 1,000 years. Federalism, why the federalism in China is so successful? Because Confucianism. The people always accept that. So that's very stable. But now the people don't accept that, including myself. I don't accept this culture. So that's why if I contribute more, I get less, of course I will shout. Why? So now I think the people, most of the people educated, especially 80s and 90s generation, they listen to nobody. They just want to freedom, democracy, enjoyment, and rich. So that's the why.
And how do you think that compares to the global South and more recently to the North American experience?
You're asking me? I just would like to, I find that a very important datum that you mentioned, and I want to do a kind of a comparison with the United States. So I go quite a bit to China, etc. I'm working with researchers. There are hundreds of revolts every day in China, and they run high risk. In the United States today, we see very little, and one of the questions that has emerged, at least in some circles, is why is there not some of the stuff that we're seeing in the indignados in Spain and in Greece, the demonstrations, and of course Britain. And it seems to me that there is a peculiar juncture that, on the one hand, you are in a phase where a vast manufacturing sector has produced a modest middle class, besides the super rich that is more speculative. You have displaced farmers who are getting poorer, who had good lives before, they're getting poorer. This is a period of voice, like it was, making reclamations, like it was in the United States and some European countries, clearly, in the early 1900s when you had organization, the whole struggle, or in England for that matter, struggles for rights, because it is a time of violent changes. People are mobilized. My reading, and this comes back to some of the issues that you raised, my reading is that in a country like the United States, but to some extent also in Northern European countries, I would say, we have become consumers of the social. We're not living that dramatic disruption that you are living, where you're mobilized just by being, the poor farmers displaced, losing their land. I mean, you're on alert. The people in the center of Shanghai in all these cities, losing their homes, etc. So you're a mobilized people, mobilized towards migrations to the cities, mobilized in terms of developing vast manufacturing, emergent working classes and middle classes, etc. In the United States, we have growing poverty, growing inequality, growing unemployment, but we're not mobilized. We have become consumers of the social, consumers of our citizenship, consumers of our democracy. And I think that that is a serious issue, and I hope you don't get to that point either there. Because so I sometimes, in this research that I'm doing, you know, I ask myself, who makes the social? The social is not a function, the social is made. And I ask myself, who makes the social today? And I think there are two actors who make the social. One is elites, because an elite is made, and elites vary enormously. Being rich is not the same as being an elite. There are many rich people who are not members of elites, and then there are elites. We had the civic elites, you know, in the United States who built the beautiful public libraries and all. Today we have a different kind of elite. And so they have to make the social, a certain kind of social. And then the poor, the immigrants, those who have to, so you have a lot of, you know, the what do we call it, the barter economy, the informal economy. I mean, immigrant communities are thriving with economic activity. And so the vast middle classes are the ones that are consuming the social, and hence they are declining. Now, I think they will get it together. I think these new generations of the sons and daughters of the middle class were getting poorer and have less, etc. I think they might be mobilizable because they have been evicted from a kind of a middle class projects that said every generation is going to do a bit better than the than their parents' generation. And that's, right now, that's over. So I think that is sort of, and then you raised a whole bunch of complicated questions that come from the longer paper where I just wanted to clarify one datum, that in the global south, one of the issues is, if you look at sub-Saharan Africa in the 50s and the 60s, it was very different from today. You had enormous development of manufacturing. You had an emergent modest middle class, working class. Now you look at Africa. I've been looking at all of these figures. Manufacturing has declined. Everything is extraction. Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, has been repositioned in the global economy as a source for minerals, for wealth, for oil, for food production for the rich classes, and all of it sort of leaves. And the manufacturing sector has been decimated. The consumption needs of people are not met by local manufacturing, they are met by big firms, you know, who bring it who knows from where. So these are, to me, extraordinary shifts. But the one thing that I need to clarify, I'm really talking about extremes. You know, there is a lot of other stuff in the middle in all of these places. But these extremes to me are heuristic. They help me see new trends in a way that the big middle doesn't. Yeah.
So one other question, and I'll open it to the floor. And that has to do with your claim of expulsion. Because it seems to me that that is perhaps an oversimplification. When firms or governments go abroad, typically that generates exchange, that generates some wealth, even if it's going from $1 a day to $2 a day. And by extension, that does generate, at some very basic level, it generates a larger number of consumers. Might be for cheap T-shirts and sandals and these sorts of things. But all of us, I think, have traveled to very poor places in the world, and you see a similar type of trend, no matter where you go,
True.
Amongst the very poorest. And it's almost as if the sort of bottom of the pyramid idea is being tapped into by people who are trying to market to these people. So how does that play out?
Well,
are they not being captured
right.
instead of expelled?
Yeah, they are poor, but they're not the poorest. You know, it used to be that being poor in the global south meant you had a little plot of land that could not feed the family for a year, for the whole year. Today, being poor, and the estimate, I mean, I don't do those figures. That many zeros, I don't know how they count them, is that up to 2 billion people, they don't even have a plot of land. So the poorest of the poor, go to the Somalia and go to, I mean, the camps for displaced people, etc. You don't see that. You see some of it, by the way. Huh? You see some of this, but there really is a level of poverty that to me is a form of expulsion. It's also the number of people who are winding up. Like last year alone, just taking a formal measure, the humanitarian system, we added 10 million plus people to the displaced. And the total now is 42 million. That gives you a sense of the rate of increase. It's like it always was increasing a bit, and then it suddenly went up like that. So there is a world that we don't get to see. You know, so when we go to the big cities and we see even very poor people in the slums.
Shanty towns, yeah.
The slums, many of these slums are not too bad, you know. I mean, really.
Right.
And then there is that other zone. So, but you are right in what you're saying, and there's that other world.
So let's open it up to the floor. Over here.
I have two questions. Professor Wang, I was so impressed by how many people in China say they're miserable and how few say they're happy. I'm very curious, do you think that that reflects the inner state of contentment of Chinese people with their lot in life, or does it tell relative to Americans? Or could there be something about the way they answer questions when they're polled about how happy they are? Does it, do they not want to be boastful, for example, when they're surveyed? I mean, I always wonder about that whenever I see this data, and I'd be very interested to know your opinion on that.
Your opinion, what? Say again, I don't get you. You mean compared to the American?
Yeah, I mean, do they really, do you think that's, you know, that they just don't want to boast when they're being asked a question? Do you really believe that that reflects their state of their minds?
That so many people are actually really unhappy.
So many people really that unhappy.
Yeah.
Can you compare it to the U.S. data, or is it a cultural difference about the way people answer questions when they're polled?
From my view, I think most Chinese, they think the Americans are very happy. They think they themselves very miserable. Okay. That's my feeling. I myself also have such a feeling.
Okay, it's interesting. I'm gonna hog the microphone for a second. And so, my second isn't really actually a question. It's a comment to Professor Sassen. And you actually heard me say this before. I don't agree with your interpretation of the and I just feel the need to express it again, of the subprime mortgage 2002 to 2005. I don't think that those are not the homes that were foreclosing. It was a 2006 to 2008 vintage that represent all those foreclosures. Most of those people, the minorities in New York, performed on their mortgage 93%. They refinanced into prime mortgages. And I think we really need to focus on what went wrong starting in 2006. And I wouldn't equate every foreclosure to a household losing their home. Much of that was house price speculation and was never occupied.
Well, you know, yes and no, because this is a mutant. Sure, I know that the most acute point is 205, 206, etc., and what follows. The process is still going on. The way, you know, we have only used very small funds of all the opportunities supposedly that the government did to rescue people from being foreclosed. I don't think you can, we know that we have over 9 million foreclosures, and I said not everybody is thrown out, but there are more coming. And I really think that this is a far more serious situation than sort of some of the reassuring statements that we hear. And we know, I have two ethnographers doing field work in the tent cities, you know, and people who have actually, they're out of their house. Now, again, I repeat, the 9.3 million foreclosures that have been tracked, many of them are not out of the house. But it is serious stuff, and some are being refinanced, and I should have added that, you're right. But anyhow, we have a disagreement, and I think it's a disagreement because I don't take one slice in time. I'm looking at what's happening. The immobility around the options that supposedly people have, the way the banks are conducting their business, it spells a rather disastrous next 2 or 3 years. So I am a bit more pessimistic, or a lot more pessimistic than you are, perhaps. But thanks for the comment, for the reminder.
So I'm seeing lots and lots of hands up. So I think what we'll do is take a group of people. We'll let the microphone roam around a little bit. On this side, back here, and then Professor Phelps is next, and then on this side of the room, we'll come over here.
It's for Professor Wang. This question of a market economy and a repressive regime comes up a lot when you're covering in the financial markets. And my base case was always the same as yours, but the bulls will always point to Singapore, which struck me as a stretch of how to manage a market economy, because of the size and because of the talent of Lee Kuan Yew. And I just wonder what you think about that. And again, if you're right, we can probably all make a lot of money in 2 or 3 years shorting China. But and my last comment is your English is much better than my Chinese. So
we're not answering now, we're taking a set of questions.
Saskia,
I think I heard you use the word capitalism a couple of times, and several times the word market. I'd just like to, and of course you were also posing the question, why isn't there a revolt? Why isn't there more complaint? I'd like to address those three things. I fully agree that there's been a deterioration in the performance of U.S. capitalism, and I would probably date it at some time in the early 1970s. And then, of course, there is the more recent failure, which is itself a whole separate story. But I also think that several large chunks of the problem have to be laid to corporatism rather than to capitalism. There's an awful lot that's gone wrong in the political system.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
I agree with that. Right.
And now, why no complaints? Well, I think in part, people are not as naive as we often think they are, and I think a lot of Americans intuitively see that our problems are largely structural, and there are no push buttons that the government can push to return the economy to prosperity. That's a whole subject, but I won't go into it. And they also see that the economy has been in the doldrums for a long time. So I've already covered my other point. So why is there no demand for solutions? Well, another reason is they probably understand that a consensus has not yet formed about some of the basic reforms that will be necessary, whether or not sufficient, to regain an adequate level of economic performance, which would require also getting back to an adequate level of innovation. Yeah, I guess that's about it. Thank you.
Let's try to squeeze two more in. The gentleman here in the front row, and then also the gentleman with the green tie midway back on the right-hand side.
Professor Sassen, for an European, what you presented is a kind of medieval panorama. There are financial castles, minerary abbeys, and the rest is a desolated landscape. One problem is that in the Middle Age, there was no democracy. And so what will happen now? Do you think democracy is supposed to fight against this new medieval scenery? Or just the opposite? Given that the impact of the forces you mentioned is so strong, we run the risk of new authoritarianism.
Okay, and one last comment here, for this round.
This is to Professor Sassen. You seem to believe that, it's here. You seem to believe that there seems to be an underlying normative claim in your talk, and that is to say, to have a good society, you have to have a middle class. So I would like you to confirm and clarify that, and also make us understand whether the existence of a middle class is the cause or the consequence of a good economy. Now, linked to that, there's probably a midterm story to be told about the existence of middle class. It is certainly true that in Europe and in the US, the middle class is decreasing. But, one of the issues is whether in the medium term, middle class in Brazil, China, and India will increase. Yes. If that were the true story, then the issue is not so much whether middle class exists or not, it's whether you're happy with the idea that there's a redistribution across countries of middle class. Is that a good economy?
Very good.
Okay. Okay, go ahead.
The point I couldn't remember is on why they're not complaining. I said earlier this afternoon, I said Americans don't like to save. And yet, wealth levels are pretty high in the country, and it's a lot of it is social wealth. A huge volume of entitlements has been created in the United States, most of it since the early 1970s, and it's been estimated at $66 trillion, which is more than 400% of the GDP. So there's a tremendous safety net. It's a safety net with lots of holes in it, but still, there's a tremendous safety net under the middle class. I heard a comment just a couple of days ago. A friend of mine was on the phone with me, and he said he saw numbers to suggest that the whole sag, that a large part of the sag of wage rates in the middle and the lower part of the income distribution has been made up by an increase in entitlements. So it's not a desirable situation. We want to see people having careers, having rewarding lives and rewarding jobs. But it takes some of the sting from it. They're being bought off by the entitlements.
Yeah, that's right.
Each of you like to respond to those various points?
Shall I go first? Ned, thank you for all of these points. And, you know, two things. On the last point, I do think that that's very important, that there is a safety net. My question, I mean, what I am doing a lot in this project is inserting a temporal dimension, because it's extremely, because these are unstable situations in a way, one way language to use. So they mutate, they change. And I see everything for me is a curve. I don't know why. So we may be on this side of the curve, about to, and then it might go negative. And so this also, is there an erosion, you know, in these entitlements? Are some of these comforts that the middle class still has in the United States inherited from an earlier moment? You see, and to when are those erosions going to actually become visible? I go to this extreme. Let's remember that when I'm talking, I consider absolute extremes. I'm saying most people are not in that situation. I go to the extremes to make visible something that in 2 years might be highly visible, but right now it's sort of a mess. And now, big question, this is to be continued. Capitalism versus markets. I sometimes am far more comfortable using the notion of markets. And what I was trying to say is that by comparing these two periods, you know, those decades of mass production, mass consumption, national political economy that is functioning, etc., hey, the market can deliver X, Y, Z. Question I have with quite a few economists with whom I talk is the algorithms that we're using to capture the notion of the market. Are they capturing today's empirics of the market? Are today's empirics such that we need to begin to feed new concepts of what a market does? Because in this country, with a lot of, in this country, not all over the world actually, the notion of the market as something that distributes, redistributes, you know, sort of something that goes in that direction rather than in this direction. According to some of the figures that we now have, the financial markets, and they are actually markets, you know, they have fewer barriers sometimes than other kinds of markets. We have one of the highest levels of concentration at the global level in financial capital than we have had in history. So what this project for me also does is bring to the fore the market and the extent to which that larger ecology that is a political economy really matters. Capitalism for me is a very, very generic term for something that has so many different manifestations, you know, that I am surprised that I even used capitalism because I thought I only used markets. But now, authoritarianism, medieval times, etc. I worked on medieval times to understand something about, you know, territory, authority, and rights, how they get constituted, assembled in different ways in medieval times, today's times, etc. But I think we have quite a bit of authoritarianism, but it doesn't take the figure of an authoritarian. There are systemic authoritarianisms. There are, I mean, when I think now today of global capital, not capitalism, global capital, it's an actant. It's a mix of technologies, technical systems, electronic networks, And sure, some elite, significant investors, etc. You know, it is not just a group of people. So I have, with the authoritarian question, it's not a subject that I have worked very much, because I find it a bit elusive, a bit ambiguous, you know. So thank you for the question. You have me thinking. I really enjoyed your question about the middle classes. You know, I threw out that term middle class. We remember the question a bit, I hope, right? There's no time to really repeat it. I threw out the term middle class because it's a historic sort of moment that I was capturing when I was talking about those decades of mass manufacturing, where it did produce a vast middle class. I also said in urban economies, having a vast, modest middle class is very important, because they feel that is their city, you know, etc. They spend it there. It produces a different economic space in the city than if you have a very rich 20%, most of the money they cannot. Now, the final point, two more points in your question. One of them is this notion of the redistributing of the middle class subject, you know, as historic subject. So more in India, more in China, more in Indonesia, less maybe in some of the Western countries, less in the sub-Saharan countries, who knows. That's an interesting idea. I hadn't thought about that, but I want to keep it as a live idea. But the final issue is, no, I'm not saying that democracy hinges or the good society hinges on the middle class. Historically speaking, I find one period where that holds. But you know what? All of these things are subject to such transformations that I'm not going to create a generic conditionality, let's say, for democracy by focusing on the middle class. You know. But really, thanks very much for these two.
Just to wrap up, because I'm aware we're way over time right now, but giving Professor Wang a chance to make a last comment on any of these questions, if you will. Sir, do you have any?
Okay, I find the Chinese economy in the recent years also eliminate the middle class from the 2004. Since the opening policy and the reform, the Chinese economy created a big amount of middle class. But from the 2004, the middle class is eliminated, including myself. I was a middle class, and actually they eliminated by the stock market, and also by the the financial crisis, and also the increase. The increase the price of houses. Okay.
It's happening.
And so now also no more middle classes. Now the China, no middle class, only the rich and the poor. The very similar to the United States. You know from that also the middle class decreased. So I don't know. This is really make me very confused. You know, including myself, so many Chinese believe the system, political system, economic system in the United States, our Chinese think this is the best. The most of us think that. So if you are interested into read the blog, you will see so many Chinese. They like the American system, and like the American life. Including myself, we think the American much more happier than the Chinese. But now when I come here, also from your data, the American also think they themselves also pay for. So this really confused me. So I will go back to to do this research and see which political system and economic system is really better. I don't know. So now I'm kind of confused.
I can give you some good other models.
Giving our speakers a hand.